Good evening, you're watching India Global. I'm Gaurie Dwivedi. Let's start the show with headlines this evening. First up, Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri is set to visit China on the 26th of January. What's next for India-China ties? We decode for you. Amid border dispute, India-Bangladesh border forces meet. India-Bangladesh forces are set to address illegal border activities in a crucial meeting. Trump moves to end birthright citizenship for many, and does that lead to chaos for H-1B visa holders? We find out. New fire erupts in Southern California. 50,000 people have been evacuated. Red flag warning has been issued. All right, we start the show with some very important news coming in. Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri is all set to travel to Beijing for a two-day visit that starts on Sunday. Mr. Misri is visiting China for a meeting of the Foreign Secretary Vice Minister mechanism, the Ministry of External Affairs said on Thursday today. The resumption of this bilateral mechanism flows from the agreement at the leadership level to discuss the next steps for this crucial relationship, including in the political, economic and people-to-people spheres, it is said. Let's quickly now get in my colleague Mohammad Ghazali joining me live to really decode what this means. Ghazali, good to have you on the show. Talk to us about this very important development. What all can we expect? What's lined up? What's the agenda?
See, I'll just quote you the sequence of events which have happened in the last 6 months at least since the Kazan summit where Prime Minister met Xi Jinping, and from there the first announcement was made that India and China have at least moved forward towards the disengagement near the Galvan Valley, near the LAC, and then the entire process started. And in that particular statement it was said that from now onwards different level of diplomatic talks and engagements will happen. After that, NSA Mr. Ajit Doval traveled to China. He met the Vice President there and also the Foreign Minister of China, and then further talks happened, and still the statement continued to say that from now onwards, beyond the border dispute issue, which has almost been resolved, which even the Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar was quoted saying once last year that almost 80% of the issue has been resolved. Now further issues between India and China will be resolved, further talks will happen, and that is exactly why now the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Vikram Misri, is traveling there. But beyond that, beyond India-China relations, what is the significance of this visit? It is very well known that Mr. Trump is now in office and he has been threatening about tariffs or putting sanctions on Russia, one of the key partners of China. And Chinese President Xi Jinping and his counterpart Vladimir Putin had that video conference meeting, waving hands to each other, that was released by the Public Relations Department from both sides, showing that particularly both these countries are very strong partners, even when Mr. Trump have been threatening both countries about sanctions or putting tariffs. Now China wants that while the situation is very volatile right now and it is very unpredictable as well, China wants to engage with its neighbors. So China is already in talks with Japan in the neighborhood, and now it wants to continue diplomatic talks with India to engage in a meaningful diplomatic talks, and that is why Mr. Misri is visiting China, and we will hope to see some more concrete statements during this visit, that what is expected or what will be the way forward from here onwards.
Right, we leave it there. Mohammad Ghazali, appreciate you taking out the time to decode that for us. Shifting focus now, External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar, who spent 4 days in the US capital as Donald Trump took over power, left for New Delhi on Wednesday after holding key meetings and talks with Donald Trump's Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and marking the latter's first bilateral engagement since assuming office on a range of issues from ties with New Delhi, Bangladesh and much more. Dr. Jaishankar was seated in the front row during the presidential inauguration at Capitol Rotunda, attended a multilateral Quad meeting, besides interacting with top officials of the new Trump administration. Let's quickly listen in to some of those important sound bites coming in from what Dr. Jaishankar said there.
I think we have a very strong degree of trust today between India and the United States. A very high level of convergence of our interests, and a sense that while we serve our national interests, while we build our bilateral partnership, definitely on regional issues and global issues, there is a lot of good that we can do. trade with Pakistan.
With Donald Trump's second presidency well underway, reports indicate that India is assessing strategic steps to respond to Trump's America First trade policy. Focusing on trade diversification, there could be some possible retaliatory measures as well, which could also include bolstering domestic industries. Several key ministries are discussing policies and the prospective impact of Trump's policies on India. It's important to note that the United States is India's largest trading partner, and thus India's response to these challenges will be crucial in mitigating any economic fallout that may come about. It's important to note that so far, Donald Trump has named two countries when it comes to tariff, which is Canada and Mexico, both of which the 20% additional tariffs will kick in from 1st of February. He hasn't named India so far. So that's very important to note that when we talk about possible trade headwinds that may come in during Trump's presidency for India. Of course, specific sectors that will have to keep their guard up is going to be pharma, textiles, possibly IT as well. That could be areas where Donald Trump's administration may look to prioritize and focus on. Remember, he has previously threatened to impose tariffs on India. He's called India a big abuser of trade ties, called India also a tariff king in his previous term. But so far, as I said, so far he hasn't said anything specific to India. All right. In his first call to a foreign leader since returning to office, US President Donald Trump reached out to his old friend, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince, MBS, or Mohammed bin Salman. During the call, the Crown Prince announced an investment of $600 billion in the United States over the next 4 years. Although it isn't clear as to where those investments and trade will actually focus on. The comments came after US President Mir, in fact, said about returning to the kingdom as his first possible foreign trip. Trump's 2017 trip to Saudi Arabia upended a tradition of US presidents first heading to the UK as their first trip abroad. Donald Trump, of course, has been known to be really shredding tradition when it comes to taking decisions that are completely unconventional, which is why his administration may like to focus on Saudi Arabia again, given that they have a deep linkage in the past. The US in recent years has increasingly pulled away from relying on Saudi oil exports, which once was the bedrock of their relationship, but there's now much more. Saudi Arabia continues to rely on US-made weapons and defense system. Okay, let's get in Mohammad Ghazali to get us an update on why this is significant and how important could this visit be for US's relationship and perspective on that entire region. Go ahead, Ghazali.
See, as Mr. Trump, was saying, addressing the press briefing, and said that even last time during his first presidency, he visited Saudi Arabia as one of the first foreign country to visit, breaking from that tradition that generally the US presidents visit UK. This time around also, he boldly announced that move that maybe the first trip would again be to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is one very powerful country in the Arab world. We also know that how Mr. Trump was the architect of the Abraham Accords when he brought many Arab countries closer to Israel, and this particular relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel has been on top of his agenda in the previous term, which couldn't fructify in Biden's term because of the October 7 attack, and then we saw what happened in the last 1.5 years. But since he's back, there is a ceasefire deal which is already activated in the region, and Saudi Arabia has time and again said that they won't have relations with Israel, they won't recognize them until a Palestinian state is established and recognized by Israel. So maybe that could be the first step, or may not. We can't say that would be immediately happening after his trip, but certainly the business interests are very vital, because US has been less dependent on the oil exports from Saudi Arabia. Also, the second important point is that even during the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi's killing and allegations on MBS, despite those facts, US continued its relations with Saudi Arabia. And then Mr. Biden in his tenure was talking about a defense pact with Saudi Arabia. Even that has not materialized. So perhaps on these two issues, normalization and a defense pact, perhaps Mr. Trump will work, and the first step would be to have business or trade ties to be stronger with Saudi Arabia. Perhaps that will be outlined in this trip when he officially makes that visit.
All right, Mohammad Ghazali, appreciate you connecting the dots for us there. All right, Donald Trump has warned that he will impose high tariffs and additional sanctions on Russia if Vladimir Putin fails to end the war in Ukraine. In a post on social media platform Truth Social, Donald Trump stated that by pushing for a resolution, he was doing Russia and Putin a very big favor, quote unquote. Donald Trump had previously said he would negotiate a settlement to Russia's full-scale invasion that was launched almost 3 years back. And he said that he would do that in a single day. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky has claimed a contingent of at least 200,000 international soldiers would be needed to guarantee Ukraine's security in any ceasefire with Russia whatsoever. Listen in.
I'm supporting the idea of contingents like a part of security guarantees, because if they have 1.5 million army, and if we will have less 2 times, it meant that we need contingents with a very strong number of soldiers.
200,000.
Europeans have 200,000, it's a minimum. It's a minimum. Otherwise, it's nothing. Otherwise, it's something, you know, like somebody, like we had OSCE, and nobody knew where they can help you. They had offices, and that's all.
Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has warned that a Russian victory over Ukraine would undermine the dissuasive force of the world's biggest military alliance and that its credibility could cost trillions of dollars. Listen.
And if we get a bad deal, it would only mean that we will see the president of Russia high-fiving with the leaders of North Korea, Iran and China. And we cannot accept that. That would be geopolitically a big mistake. It will not be billions extra, it will be trillions extra. Because if Ukraine loses, then to restore the deterrence of the West, of NATO.
In a first legislative win to President Trump, the U.S. Congress on Wednesday gave the final approval to a GOP-led bill that would require the detention and deportation of undocumented migrants who entered the U.S. without authorization and are charged with certain crimes. The bill, titled the Laken-Riley Act, capped the opening salvo in a broader crackdown on immigration that the president has promised. The bill is named after a 22-year-old Georgia student who was killed last year while out for a run. An undocumented migrant from Venezuela was convicted and sentenced to life without parole for her murder. All right, turning our attention now to the neighborhood, where in the backdrop of recent border fencing issues, India and Bangladesh's border forces, that is the BSF, Border Security Force, and the BGB, that is Border Guard Bangladesh, held talks to address concerns, maintain peace and curb cross-border illegal activities. As per a statement released, discussions emphasized on combating illegal activities across the border, addressing media misconceptions about border disputes and improving coordination to prevent such incidents, with both sides agreed to find solutions regarding border issues through regular dialogue. All right, let's get in my colleague Saurabh Gupta, who's been joining me from Kolkata live to give us a lowdown of what really took place in this meeting. Saurabh, a very crucial meeting given the fact that a lot of bad blood has happened on the fencing issue. Talk to us about what are your sources telling you. Any breakthrough, or do you think that will still take some time?
Well, over the last few days, there have been incidents that are worrying on the India-Bangladesh border, and West Bengal shares the largest border with Bangladesh, and therefore the BSF, which is India's border security force and guards the India-Bangladesh border, and the BGB, which is the Border Guard Bangladesh, which guards the border on the Bangladesh side, have had skirmishes over fencing, over erection of fences and other issues, including, people trying to infiltrate or people trying to smuggle contraband into India. Now, in that context, the BGB and the BSF have meetings, but this one is important because this one, of course, is to ensure that there is a certain amount of coordination between the two, forces, and the sector commander level coordination meeting held between the BSF and BGB to ensure peace and cooperation along the India-Bangladesh border is what the statement from the BSF says. In fact, on January 22, it says that a border coordination meeting between Deputy Inspector General of the BSF Malda sector and Sector Commander of the BGB Rajshahi sector was held at the border outpost Sona Masjid in Bangladesh. And this high-level meeting, it says that such a high-level meeting highlights the commitment of both forces towards strengthening bilateral relations and ensuring the sanctity of the international border. Now, the border area, you know, has been a concern since August this year, where anti-India elements in Bangladesh have openly, you know, talked about, crossing over, talked about, harming the territorial integrity of India. And that is something that perhaps both the BSF and the BGB realize needs to be taken seriously, and this meeting is perhaps a step towards that. Having said that, these meetings also happen regularly because there are issues that need to be ironed out on a regular basis, but this one is important in the current context and the skirmishes that we've been seeing on the India-Bangladesh border in the last few days.
All right, Saurabh, appreciate you taking out the time to give us that update. And viewers, on that note, we slip into a very short break. On the other side, well, fire near Los Angeles has now spread to 8,000 acres. What does this mean? Is it due to climate change, or is there more to it? We come back and talk more on that. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching India Global. We now turn our attention to the latest that's unfolding in Los Angeles, where thousands have been evacuated in the LA County as a fast-growing wildfire has erupted. The blaze has grown rapidly to over 8,000 acres, fueled by strong winds and dry brush, forcing 50,000 people to flee. Interstate 5, the I-5, a key highway along the west coast, has been shut down, though no homes or businesses have been damaged so far. This comes as the region is already grappling with two massive wildfires that happened earlier this month, destroying multiple neighborhoods.
We have over 4,000 firefighting personnel assigned to the incident, and we had a very robust ground and air response to the incident that you see behind me.
All right, Zerrin Osho, who's the Director of Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, joins me live from Washington, D.C. Thanks much, Zerrin, for speaking to me. Talk to us about what do you think is the reason why the LA fires have once again happened, and do you think this is part of a larger climate change issue? How do you read it, the cause of it?
Hi, Gaurie. Good evening, and thank you so much for having me. So we do not know the exact cause of what caused the fire. But what we do know is that climate change has a huge role to play in what has been the devastation before our eyes. And it's an interesting development, particularly in the backdrop of President Trump now exiting the Paris Agreement. I think what is very important to note is that there is a phenomenon of hot winds that are carried through the mainlands to the coastlands. These are called the Santa Ana winds, which are really high-speed winds. So whenever the fire and the exact point and cause of fire, wherever it was caused in the Palisades, then spread across a very wide range of area following these winds. And now we know that apart from the Palisades, the Hughes, which is another neighborhood in northern LA, has also been grappling with these new fires that have come about, and the expected damage is approximately 9,500 hectares of land. So this is going to come at a large cost. We've also seen that the insurance and actuarials working on this devastation have estimated these losses to be anywhere between tens of billions of US dollars. This has a direct impact on the insurance premiums that are going to be paid by residents. Will insurance companies be willing to insure these homes again is still unknown. But what is also a very important point to note is the rainfall. Now, that is not a phenomenon that has caused necessarily this wildfire in this instance, but it is very much a major contributing part of what the fire has been able to do and the devastation that has been caused. LA this summer, since May 2024, has received extremely, strikingly low historically low rainfall. And according to some of the early estimates that are coming from studies, we now know that this rainfall is
Okay.
10% less than the average.
Okay. So, which brings me to ask you that, Zerrin, I understand what you're saying. These are factors that are extraneous factors, but you know, one cannot help but talk about the fact that this comes at a time when US itself is also internally debating how it wants to, or if at all it wants to, address climate change as a larger issue. Poorer countries are suffering much more. They rely on developed countries. They rely on America. And the fact that America has exited the Paris Accord, how do you see the larger climate issue? I'm not talking particularly about the wildfires here now.
Yes, Gauri, that's an interesting question, and one is yet to see what actually will happen. But as far as climate change is concerned, it's not an opinion, it's a fact. And what is happening, the unfortunate incidents in LA are a testament to that fact. I think it's high time we wake up to the calling of what is going to happen, because it's not going to be easy to live in. If this is the condition of, you know, the United States of America and LA, which is the hotspot for all celebrities from Hollywood, one can only imagine what the implications of this would be in the developing world. And one thing to keep in mind is, yes, this is the second time that President Trump would have now exited the Paris Agreement. It certainly undermines the entire treaty process. You know, one can also debate if America is going to, you know, figure out its stance on climate change based on the presidents. That does not necessarily send a really great signal out to the world about what America wants to do and what is the general consensus on climate change. But again, it doesn't take away from the fact that this is reality. This is not it is not an opinion. It cannot be contested.
It is an uncontested fact, and the world is facing. It's not just America when it comes to climate change. Zerrin, appreciate you taking out the time to speak to me on India Global. All right, turning our attention now to the Middle East, where Yemen's Iran-aligned Houthis have released the crew of the Galaxy Reader more than a year after they seized their Bahamas-flagged vessel off the Yemeni Red Sea coast. It said the crew were handed to Oman in coordination with the three-day-old ceasefire in Gaza's war between Israel and the Palestinian terror group Hamas. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump issued an executive order initiating a process to redesignate the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels as a foreign terror organization on Wednesday, returning the group to the same status it held at the end of his first administration. All right, shifting to Nepal, where for the first time in nearly a decade, the price to climb Mount Everest will soon increase as Nepal announces a sharp markup in permit fees. From September, those seeking to summit the world's tallest mountain during peak season will have to pay $15,000. This is a 40%, nearly I beg your pardon, a 36% rise from the long-standing fee of $11,000. Fees for those wanting to climb outside the peak April to May period will also increase by the same percentage, meaning it will cost now $7,500 during September to November and about $3,750 during the very tough period of December to February, when anywhere very, very few people would be attempting to do that. All right, on that note, we slip into a very short break. We come back on the other side with our big debate on what really does Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship mean for India and for Indian Americans and the diaspora. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching India Global with me, Gaurie Dwivedi. The big story that we are focusing on right now, Trump's executive order, issued late Monday and spanning roughly 700 words, fulfills a campaign promise. However, its outcome is uncertain, with a lengthy legal battle over immigration policies likely. How will this impact the Indian American community? President Donald Trump's executive order ending automatic citizenship for babies born to non-permanent residents has left families scrambling to ensure their children's futures. An attorney general, in fact, from 22 states have filed a lawsuit to prevent President Trump from ending the decades-old birthright citizenship policy, which guarantees US-born children citizenship regardless of their parents' immigration status. The Democratic attorneys and immigrant rights advocates have the question of the birthright citizenship is settled law, and that while presidents have broad authority, they are not kings. Meanwhile, in a race against the clock, reports suggest that many expectant Indian parents in the US are opting for preterm C-sex to beat the February 20th deadline for birthright citizenship. Many Indian women, particularly those in their 8th or 9th month of pregnancy, are seeking to schedule a C-section before the 20th of February, the cutoff date after which babies born to non-permanent residents will no longer automatically receive US citizenship. What's this chaos all about? What happens next? We try and decode all that for the lakhs of Indian Americans watching this broadcast live. But first up, listen into this soundbite from Dr. Jaishankar.
You know, we have a position on mobility which is a principal position, applies to all countries. As a government, we obviously are very much supportive of legal mobility because we do believe in a global workplace. We want Indian talent and Indian skills to have the maximum opportunity at a global level. At the same time, we are also very firmly opposed to illegal mobility and illegal migration, because you also know that when something illegal happens, many other illegal activities get joined onto it.
Before I get in the guests this evening, Karthik Ramakrishnan, Soundarya Bala Subramani, as well as Alison Kranz, I want to tell our viewers the questions that we are putting forth on this broadcast and why it matters to every Indian American watching this. The first key question is that how will this really impact Indian Americans? What will be their status going forward? Could families of H-1B visa holders face possible deportation? Is that something they now need to brace for? That's the second question that we're going to pose to our panel. And the other key point, could a judge actually rule against Trump's order? As I said, there are 22 attorney generals who've actually challenged this. Is there a possibility that Trump's order will actually not stand the judicial scrutiny? And how will this alter US's population demographics? That's also something that we're going to put forth to our panel. Let's get in, as I said, Karthik Ramakrishnan, Soundarya Balasubramani, as well as Alison Kranz as well. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining. It's really early in your parts of the world, so appreciate you joining. Karthik, let me start with you. Before I come to the demography part and the other parts of it, I want to start by asking you, how big a bummer is this? How big a setback is this for the Indian American community?
Thank you for having me. Well, first, I think it's important to note that this is an executive order that is already being challenged in the courts, and it is very unlikely to stand constitutional scrutiny. But, you know, what I'm saying, it's extremely unlikely. There is a slight possibility. The Supreme Court has surprised us over the last few years, including on abortion rights. So something like a right that has stood for 150 years, it might decide that now is the time to take a fresh look at the interpretation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So should Indian Americans be concerned? I think they should be. I think regardless of whether this stands up in the courts, this sends a very clear message that the U.S. is less open to immigrants of all stripes, including high-skilled immigrants whose children might not automatically become U.S. citizens. That makes the U.S. less competitive in a global marketplace. If you look at countries like Canada and Australia, that they may be looking for as alternative places to live and work.
Soundarya, let me then, come and bring you in on the fact that, the uncertainty that has suddenly come in for Indian Americans and the fact that some of them actually do stare at deportation as a possibility. Let me, ask you this, that what really is the kind of recourse that they have, or if at all, they have any?
I do think we should make it clear that this does not lead to any sort of deportation. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're talking about when you say deportation, but what this takes away is a very fundamental right that has been given for decades. And the irony of this...
No, there can be also children who could be older in age, right? They may be, let's say, in their teens and all. They would, of course, be staring at deportation, right? And if you send away your children, then it also disrupts the entire family, doesn't it?
I think you're talking about, there's something called documented dreamers. These are children who were not born in the US, but then moved to the US when they were 2, 3 years old, and they spent their entire lives in the US. So when they turn 21, they get deported if they don't switch to another visa class. In fact, I think there's about more than 250,000 children like this in the US right now, of which more than 70% are of Indian descent, who at the age of 21 have to switch to some non-dependent visa. They cannot be a dependent on their parents anymore. So they have to switch to an F1, H1B, O1, or any of the other visas out there.
175,000 such people that we are talking about. Okay, yes.
Exactly. But if this order goes through and it's not challenged in court, then we will have several 100,000 more such children come up in the next decade. Because as of today, I think there's more than 1.5 million legal immigrants, Indian immigrants, who are in the US waiting for a green card. And they've been waiting for more than a decade. And it just doesn't make sense to take away this right for them, because these are not people who just went there for a few months and now they're deciding to leave. But these are people who spent a decade paying taxes, living there, and they're not getting the green card only because of the country caps and this huge backlog that's been formed.
Indeed. And Alison, before I come to you on the legality of this and the constitutional rights and what does really the US Constitution say, Karthik Prabhakrishnan, let me ask you this question that has been baffling me ever since I heard this, which is the fact that what started out as a fight against illegal immigrants is now targeting probably the most highly skilled workforce in the US. How does that make sense?
Yeah, I think if you understand, so I've been studying immigration opinion and immigration policy for 2 decades now. And what you're seeing now is a pretty far fringe of the conservative movement and the anti-immigration or immigration restriction movement taking center stage, right? So most Americans don't approve of these kinds of policies, but for several years now, you've had activists in the conservative movement who want to not only restrict undocumented or illegal immigration, but even legal immigration. So Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas a few years ago, when Trump was president, introduced legislation to cut back on family visas. So what you're seeing is a nativist sentiment that we last saw in the 1920s, when the U.S. effectively shut down most immigration, including from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. Back then, they were trying to, quote unquote, make America great again by taking it back to what the population looked like in the 1870s. So you're seeing a similar kind of move where it's for a lot of conservative activists, it's not the legality or the illegality. They see this as a cultural threat to the future of the United States.
Okay.
And for a lot of people, it's the racial replacement theory that is circulating and is gaining more currency.
Okay.
And they want to try to prevent the U.S. from diversifying further.
Alison, the question I want to ask you, Alison, is about the fact that 22 states have challenged this. Everybody is saying, or those who've challenged it said that, there's no way that this will stand in a court of law. Explain to us what are the legalities of it and where does the law really stand on this?
Sure, of course. I think that there has been a minority of legal scholars who have put forth this theory that the 14th Amendment has been misinterpreted. Now, for the 14th Amendment to be misinterpreted, we have to keep in mind a couple different things, including the language of this particular provision was actually put into statute and codified into law. So if something was being interpreted incorrectly, it could have been changed. The language of the law could have changed when Congress codified that section. But what happens from here is really that, as Karthik mentioned, there have been legal challenges. And even today, 2 different courts in the United States are hearing those challenges and will decide whether to issue a preliminary injunction. A preliminary injunction wouldn't necessarily stop the full process from happening, but it would pause the February 20th date and allow this matter to move up into the appellate system and then ultimately be heard by the Supreme Court.
Okay. So let's say you are an H-1B visa holder now, or you wish to go to the US now and your employer there has sponsored you and you've got your H-1B visa. Alison, what is the kind of uncertainty that this candidate is facing?
An individual who has an H-1B visa will not necessarily be affected unless they're having children. This provision does not, this executive order does not impact children already born. It's only going to impact babies going forward. And so an individual who holds H-1B status will only be affected if they're having children in the future, if this executive order is found to be legal.
Okay. Then let me then get in both Karthik as well as Saundarya on this, which is that, let's say, again, I'm asking the same question, rephrasing it, Karthik, which is that if there is a candidate who has been sponsored by the employer, will go or can go, the fact that the family faces this kind of uncertainty, will that then make this candidate, his or her decision, be changed subject to the uncertainty that he or she may face?
I would say almost certainly it will. Now, there are many decisions that go into, where people decide to move and to work. And people, a big part of people making their lives in a new country, even if, say, they're H-1B workers that ultimately decide to go back to their home countries like India, the ability to keep families together and to secure a certain set of rights for one's spouses and children is a bedrock principle. Especially for Indian immigrants, they will look not only at the US, at other places for employment opportunities in terms of the ability to advance their career, but also to secure their rights in that country. So this will make a difference. It probably already is making a difference. It's creating uncertainty. And for a lot of immigrants, they might decide, you know what, I might be better off in a country like Canada or Australia rather than go to the US.
Saundarya, how big a brain drain do you think this could actually be for America in the long term? Because they're talking about wanting to get top-notch talent, but this is the setback, this is the flip side of uncertainty, that candidates may choose other regions. How big a impact this could be in a possible brain drain?
I actually think Indian immigrants specifically have had uncertainty for a while in the US. This is just another layer of that uncertainty adding on. And as Karthik said, I think at some point people will ask the question, when is this enough? When is enough enough? And I've had a few messages sent to me personally already on social media of people asking, is it still worth it going to the US anymore, given all these restrictions? But I will say, just from the numbers, the pandemic put a big dent on the number of people moving to the US for education. However, the numbers have come to pre-pandemic levels and they keep increasing. If you just look at the number of students who go to the US to study masters and higher education, that hasn't really changed despite the other restrictions that have come up in the last few years or when Trump took office the last time. So it doesn't seem to have made a difference in the last 8 years. So I don't know, but I do think at some point people will feel that enough is enough. But I want to just call out one last thing, that if this rule goes through, it will have an impact for people who have children after February 28th.
Yes.
However, the children won't have an impact until they turn 21, at which point they will have to leave the country. And so you do have this time when parents can take a decision to leave the country, and it doesn't have to be
immediate. Right, no immediate decision is needed, is what you're trying to say. Alison,
exactly.
I'm wrapping this up, but final word to you. If you have to give one message, one advice to people who are listening to this and are getting impacted, what would that be?
To be diligent, to monitor the news, to watch how this develops. It could be a year or more before we actually have an answer. But the U.S.'s culture, traditions, and beliefs are that we're a nation of immigrants, and I hope that prevails.
All right. Thank you so much, all three of you, for speaking to me on this very important debate that, as I said, our audiences world over are watching. And on that note, we slip into a very short break. We come back with more interesting stories on the other side. Stay with us. All right, turning our attention to Southport killer who is set to be sentenced today for murdering 3 young girls in a brutal knife attack that took place last year in UK. The 18-year-old ambushed a Taylor Swift-themed dance class in Southport, stabbing and killing those girls aged between 6 and 9 with a 20-centimeter kitchen knife. As a trial was set to begin in Liverpool on Monday, the teenager pleaded guilty to the murder of the 3 children, attempted murders of 10 others, as well as 2 terror-related charges. He also admitted to producing a biological toxin, possessing materials related to terrorism, and carrying a weapon, including the knife used in the attack. The horrific attack sparked violent protests across the UK, fueled by fair bit of claims on social media. There was also a crackdown that came in from Starmer's government right after that. So what does this mean for the UK, the divisions that came to the fore after these riots and during those riots? Let's get in Professor Scott Lucas, who's joining us live from Dublin in Ireland, to talk to us about the significance of this trial, this conviction, what it means. Professor Lucas, good to have you on the show. Talk to us about the impact this case has had and will have on the British society.
Well, I think first and foremost, of course, is the impact on those lives that were taken, those 3 young girls who were killed. I think it was 9 girls and staff who were seriously wounded, whose lives will never be the same, because this young man, who was 17 at the time, decided he would carry out a mass killing for whatever reason that was there. And certainly, as you have mentioned, he did possess an Al-Qaeda training manual. He did possess materials about how to make ricin, the nerve agent. But what happened, and we need to be very precise about what happened, is that British society was ripped apart, not specifically because of this young man. It was ripped apart because of disinformation, false information, especially from the far right in the UK. And that disinformation fueled riots for almost 2 weeks throughout many British cities by very small groups, but groups that got a lot of headlines by trying to burn migrant centers, etc.
Professor Lucas, this case brought the divisions to fore, didn't it? The underlying issues related to immigrants, the underlying issues within the society about how Europe is now trying to grapple with the problem of illegal immigrants. All that came to fore with this case, didn't it?
It was brought to the fore by disinformation. Before this case, we even had the details. In late July, as the police were investigating the case, the activist, the far-right activist, Tommy Robinson, put out the information that the attacker was an Arab, possibly a Muslim. He put out a false name. That claim spread through social media and was amplified by the leader of Britain's Reform Party to claim that the police were covering up an act of terrorism by an Arab. When the actual information came out that the young man in this case was 17 and is of Rwandan descent, but is a UK citizen, it was too late. Already we were getting the far right that were attacking the migrant centers on the false claim that an immigrant had carried this out. Yes, migration is a serious issue in the UK, and how to deal with migration is an issue that needs to be addressed responsibly. But these far-right riots were not about a responsible response to migration. They were an attempt to rip apart British society further by targeting migrants, thus making the problem worse.
Okay, which brings me to ask you that, do you think this sentencing, how do you think that is going to impact public opinion or shape public opinion going forward on an issue that had a huge impact on British society?
What it should do is to make people think about how, for example, young people could be radicalized, if you want to use that term, in terms of their thoughts, their opinions, and their actions where they will want to take lives. What would be the effect of the media environment? What would be the effect of the cultural environment that would lead to this? But this is an ongoing question. This is a question we should all be concerned about without just simply throwing out the word terrorism. How do you deal with young people and the issues that they have? The problem here is that as I speak to you, the right-wing media and right-wing politicians are not talking about this issue. They are falsely accusing the UK government of a cover-up to protect migrants. In other words, they're going back to the same disinformation last July because they have a political agenda not to address these issues with the concern about young people, about their communities, and about violence, but because they actually want to spread disruption for their own attempts to take political power.
Okay, very quickly, Professor Lucas, then I want to ask you that, what about some of those clamp down measures that were put in place for social media last year by Keir Starmer? Many have said that he's actually imposed very draconian measures on passing social media messages and that. Do you think that will also come to an end?
There was no clampdown on X, which was the major place where these disinformation was being put out by Elon Musk. What happened is there were individual cases where police went to those who put out those messages on the grounds that they could constitute hate crimes, hate speech. They questioned people in those cases, but in almost no case was anyone even in prison for this. So there was not this clampdown on social media that Elon Musk and his ally, the Reform Party's Nigel Farage, alleged. You can go to X right now and see these types of messages continuing to spread. So no, I'm afraid this is a diversion. What the Starmer government did, and you can criticize their specific policies.
I'm going to interrupt him right now.
What the Starmer government has done is tried to deal with this case responsibly, both as a legal case and both in terms of trying to prevent this type of rioting that we've seen. They did it at the time. They succeeded in quelling the rioting quite effectively. And what they're trying to do is to avoid further disruption on Britain's streets by actually stating the facts of the case, as they did in Parliament.
I'll have to wrap this up right here, Professor Lucas. Thanks so much for giving that perspective to us on an issue that really did have huge ramifications for the British society. Okay, shifting focus now to a short clipping of snippet actually of a podcast that NDTV World has started. It's called Spot On, where we spoke to C. Raja Mohan on US-India ties under Trump 2.0. Listen in, and the whole podcast is available on NDTV World YouTube page. Given that Donald Trump is a negotiator, he wants to sort of close deals. Do you think this would really be the hallmark of how he approaches relationship with India?
Not just with India, with everyone. So he's a deal maker. He's not saying, I'll tell you what is it and nothing can be done. He's saying, look, let's talk. And he loves negotiating. He loves deals. So I think that's where India's traditional style has been the other way. We announce a principle, and after that we don't have any flexibility. And that's why, despite India's growth of trade, in the WTO, everywhere India is seen with great suspicion, because we don't know when to stop bargaining and when to close a deal.